Okay, thanks very much. I'll let Sue introduce the panelists, but let me just say a word about our moderator, Sue Tierney. She's a managing principal at Analysis Group. I don't know anyone who is not a huge fan of Sue Tierney. She's one of the world's leading energy experts. She led the DOE transition team for the Obama administration, served as Assistant Secretary of Energy at DOE during the Clinton administration, held senior positions in state government for Democrats and Republicans, and truly is an all-of-the-above energy expert. She's a former state public utility commissioner. She also served on the Secretary of Energy Advisory Board on shale gas. She's on the National Petroleum Council and also in the New England Clean Energy Council Hall of Fame. So she covers the landscape. I'm grateful for her friendship and grateful that she's here today. Thanks very much. Sue Tierney.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you for staying around for this final panel, for which you will not be disappointed. We have 4 rock stars. Now, we just heard from a real rock star, but these guys are also rock stars, and I'm very happy to welcome them for this last panel. You have heard from Jason, you've heard from Dan Yergin, and let me introduce the other 2 panelists for your attention here today. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to start with a number of questions to try to connect some of the dots between some of the themes that we've heard here today. And then I would welcome you to write down questions on your cards if you have some, and I'll decide if I want to ask them or not. So first, let me introduce Carlos Pascual. His official title is Special Envoy and Coordinator for International Energy Affairs. He is an ambassador and has served in very senior positions in the State Department, at the USAID. He has been U.S. Ambassador to Mexico. He has served in Europe, Eurasia, the Middle East, and Africa. He has tremendous experience on these topics in global energy issues, but also many other public policy issues more broadly. He was at Brookings Institution, which of course will be a competitor of this Columbia Center, but he was at Brookings Director and Vice President for Foreign Policy Studies, and he's truly an expert. We're very honored to have you here. And the 4th panelist is someone I love to call and claim as a friend of mine. Andrew Steere is, for the most recent year, the 3rd president of World Resources Institute, where he has come after serving for decades at the World Bank and in the United Kingdom national government. He has worked as an expert on international development issues for that time. He has served as country director in Vietnam and Indonesia. He has been instrumental in his most recent position at the World Bank for guiding billions of dollars of investment and international policy discussions on climate change as the special envoy for climate change at the World Bank. The World Resources Institute, of which I am a board member and therefore I'm not very objective, is very lucky to have him, and we are lucky to have him as a member of the panelists. So with that, let's let the games begin. And let me start with one question. And it's a question that has been coming up throughout the day. Oh, actually, I'm not going to start a question. I just changed my mind, if you don't mind. I would like both Ambassador Pascual and Andrew Steere to open with some brief comments about your point of view and some of the issues that you would at least want to put on the table for conversation. Ambassador.
Sue, thank you. Wow, you know, after the lineup, Jason, that you've had here, I feel like it's all been said. We haven't all said it, so I can say some of the same things again, which I will try not to do, and we'll get into, I think, a really interesting discussion. I would just highlight a couple of things. One, in his discussion, National Security Advisor Tom Donilon talked about the importance of the United States being engaged, staying engaged on international security issues. I can't reinforce the importance of that enough. we are tied in oil, certainly, in what is a global energy market. Gas, as you've already heard, is increasingly becoming a global energy market. Instability in any part of the world is going to have an impact on global prices. It's going to affect our productivity here at home. We have a direct interest in stability in international markets, and we have an obligation and a national security and a domestic economic productivity interest to stay engaged in peace and stability in the Middle East and the security of transit lanes and peace and stability throughout the world, and I just can't reinforce that enough. A second point, which I think we're still trying to get our heads around, is the reality that the majority of the energy demand growth throughout the world is in the non-OECD countries. And so one of the things that we're just not accustomed to thinking about is that countries like China and India and Brazil and South Africa are going to be the countries that are the demand pull factor on global energy prices. And so what happens in those countries and their ability to satisfy their national demand is going to be so critical to the prices that we pay at home. And that gives us a direct interest in how China is consuming fuel, how much fuel it consumes, and where it gets it from. And we're not used to thinking about that kind of an equation and how we incorporate that into our international security policy. And I think that's a key factor that we have been pursuing with Secretary Clinton, with Secretary Kerry, is absolutely and adamantly engaged on these issues. A third point I wanted to stress is the linkage between positive climate opportunities and job creation. The IEA has estimated that over the next 20 years or so, through 2035, there's going to be about $17 trillion of investment in power generation, transmission, and distribution. The majority of that is in generation, about $10 trillion of it, and about $6 trillion of that is actually in renewable power. So these issues of how we generate power and get access to electricity are fundamental to the future energy infrastructure of the future. It's going to have a fundamental impact on the nature of that energy and how clean it is and what it does to the environment. We have an opportunity to be able to open markets and be able to sell products in thermal, wind, solar, gas, geothermal, smart grids, metering that have a positive impact on the environment and for American industries and are good for our jobs back at home. And so we're often caught up in these debates at times about climate change. Is this good for the economy? Is it bad for the economy? One of the things that's absolutely clear here is that there is a market opening here that it is fundamentally in the interests of the United States to help support and develop. And if we do that, it's also positive for the environment. Last thing I wanted to just say on the environment, on gas, on climate. The IEA has done some excellent analysis looking at projections of increased gas consumption over time. What they demonstrate, and Ryan Lance indicated this in his comments, I thought it was very constructive, that gas generally has had a profile that might be 40, 50% less in CO2 emissions than we might get out of coal. What we've also seen is that as IEA has done its projections into the future, that even with a massive increase in gas consumption, we can end up in a world of 650 parts per million CO2 concentrations and a 3.5 degrees centigrade temperature increase. We've got to remember that. So what gas gives us is a huge opportunity as a bridging fuel to take advantage of it during a period of time in particular where it gives us the capacity to really look at opportunities to switch from coal to gas, oil or diesel to gas generation, reducing emissions, getting greater flexibility in liquids markets if we can get that kind of switch from oil or diesel to gas. But at the same time, we've got to keep asking the question, how do we use gas as a baseload fuel? How do we integrate it with renewables? How do we take advantage of this period of time to have the long-term environmental impact that we need to have to maintain the sustainability of the planet? I think these are just a few of the big challenges that I just wanted to round out from many of the excellent comments that have already been made.
Thank you, Ambassador. Dr. Steere.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you, Jason. It's great to be here. We need your institute. Count on us to support you. Nothing could really be more important. Daniel laid out 3 questions at the beginning. He said, is there enough energy? Then what are the links between energy and security and risk? And third, energy and the environment. First, good news this morning. I mean, it's incredibly encouraging. There is enough energy. The question is there enough for the 1.3 billion people who actually don't have any electricity in the world today? So this must be a guiding light for your institute, I think. Not having electricity in your house is really grim. Chances are your daughter won't go to school, or you'll pull her out early because she has to go and collect food. Chances are that you will transmit poverty to the next generation. It's not difficult to bring electricity. I lived in Vietnam, saw the access to electricity rise from 50% to 97% today, literally in 20 years, with the right kind of policies, with the right kind of international support. So that's number one. Number two, on the environment and climate change link. This morning we've heard about a revolution that's taken place. I mean, it's really inspiring to hear, what's happened to the energy picture. We now need a revolution in our understanding of how energy relates to the economy. For example, turns out that we are currently paying people to waste electricity and waste energy. Energy subsidies for fossil fuels amount to $500 billion a year. Now, it turns out they don't actually benefit the poor. The average rich family gets 6 times as much out of energy subsidies as the average poor family. We should abolish them. And it's not just poor countries that subsidize energy. Rich countries do too, mostly on the production side. So that's $500 billion that we're spending to pay people to use more energy than they need to, and particularly paying rich people to consume more. Makes no sense. 2 weeks ago or a month ago, the International Monetary Fund brought out a report. They wrote this for ministers of finance, ministers of planning, and they said not only is it $500 billion that you're throwing money largely down the drain, but actually, if you take environmental externalities and what they call optimal tax, you're actually wasting $1.9 trillion. Now, it turns out, this is the IMF, it's ministers of finance, they're saying it's crazy what we're doing. What we ought to be doing is stopping taxing good things like labor and profits, and we should start taxing bad things like pollution. Can be done. Last week in the Clean Energy Ministerial, which is a wonderful organization, I see David Sandelow, he's spearheaded that, President Obama started, brings 25 of the leading countries in the world who really care about clean energy. It was fascinating to see some of these key economists, Montek Ahluwalia, who's the chief economist of India effectively, sort of really starting to say, wait a minute, we could really do something smart here. So we've got to get that economic revolution going, because it turns out that all that we need to do on climate change by 2020, say, more than half of that can be achieved through win-win mechanisms. Finally, just a word on and by the way, I mean, once you see what energy efficiency can do, it makes a huge difference. Compare Beijing and New York, for example. Now, if you look at per capita emissions for China, they're only 1/3 of what they are in the United States. But look at per capita emissions in New York, they're lower than per capita emissions in Beijing. A well-designed city, well-managed, can actually not only help solve global environmental problems, turns out is extremely good for your economy as well. So I think an important, obviously, I know you, Jason, so an important part of the work of this outfit is precisely to look at that economic revolution. Just finally, just one word on the risk side that Daniel talked about. When, if you are the energy strategy manager for China, for example, and you're worried about security, if you look at, for example, the water risk projection models that we do at the World Resources Institute, and you overlay them on where you're going to be doing your fracking, where you're actually generating electricity from coal, which needs a lot of water, and you overlay them on your hydroelectric schemes, you find that actually life is very risky moving forward. And so I think this link to national security is exceedingly important, but it applies not just to countries, it applies to companies. If you go to Bangalore today, I was there, we're working in Bangalore, the leading companies there, Infosys, Walmart, which has its back office, is there, Accenture, IBM, Wipro, all of them have said, we want to purchase more renewable energy. Why? Because it's good for our security. We can predict our power supply better if we could do that. But at the moment, it turns out it's extremely difficult to do. The market doesn't exist. The utilities are resistant. Developers are not willing to have a financial relationship with the utility. They'd be delighted to have a financial relationship with the Walmarts and the Wipros. So what we're doing is getting these guys together and saying, wait a minute, actually, there may be some win-win. We can put the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together. At the moment, all the different pieces of the jigsaw puzzle are there, but they're simply not interlocking. So fascinating set of issues.
Well, so we just broadened the conversation in many ways. And I want to come back to a theme that everyone has talked about today, and it's to ask you a number of dimensions about the shale gas opportunity, but talk about how we do that sustainably. So we've heard about the game-changing nature of shale gas development, not only in the United States, and each of you has different perspectives, and I'm really interested in this question about doing it sustainably from a geopolitical point of view, from a global climate change point of view, or social license to have continued access to shale gas resources. Sustainable development to enable exports, among other things. So each of you, I know, has different points of view on these, but how does the United States really engage in that? And if you have any suggestions for Jason about what his center might do, feel free to throw those in as well. Who wants to begin?
All right.
Ambassador, you're on the spot.
I'll start off. The State Department, this got started during the time that we were working with Jason when he was both on the National Security Staff and the Council of Environmental Quality, began a program which is now called the Unconventional Gas Technical Exchange Program. And the basic philosophy of this is that if you're going to develop unconventional gas, you should reflect the best practices that we've learned in the world. And so what we've done from the State Department is coordinate very closely with our colleagues in the Department of Energy and EPA at a state level. The Department of Interior has been particularly involved, given federal lands, with individual companies that are involved in hydraulic fracturing, as well with NGO groups. And so what we have been doing is trying to take lessons on the best practices, many which Dan, I'm sure, is going to talk about from his work on the Secretary's Energy Advisory Board, a special report that they did. But we're trying to look at the best practices on air quality, on water use, on hydraulic fracking fluids, on seismic impact, on engagement of communities and the impact on local infrastructure, what has worked, what has not worked, and how to do this in a way that will result in sustainable practices. We have facilitated exchange programs with countries ranging from Poland, Ukraine, Jordan, China, Colombia, Chile. There are a number of others that have been involved in the process. And the perspective that we've taken is that if a country has the resources available, and if they're going to pursue this route, then we should do everything that we can to facilitate their ability to get the best information. Final thing I'll say in this is that we've also worked very closely with the International Energy Agency to help them become a repository where they can maintain that kind of information and make it available to countries all around the world. And so the IEA has now been hosting some of its own seminars focused on these kinds of issues, and increasingly you get countries coming to them and looking for additional information.
And their golden rules for a golden age of natural gas is an important element of that. Dan.
Well, Sue, of course, played a key role in the report to this Secretary of Energy on the environmental aspects of shale gas. This is the study that really Jason did so much to engender to happen because it was clear that it needed to happen. And I think the conclusions that I take away, and we should see if we have the same conclusions too, is that obviously that the issue of chemicals, which was very inflammatory 2 years ago, really is was not an issue. What is an issue is what do you do with spent water? And some regions, what about water? What about air quality? And I know, I see Mark Brownstein there, that EDF is very focused on that, among other questions. And thirdly, what you said is community impact. I remember sitting with a congressman from Western Pennsylvania, and he said one of his big problems for his constituents is they're saying, why are all these license plates from Oklahoma and Texas now showing up in our community? And it was a sense of these trucks coming in, who are these people, how are these changing? And I think we've seen an evolution on all of these issues. It seems to me enormous amount of innovations going into the water question to address it. And so it's, these are issues to be managed. My sense is that they are largely being managed. Otherwise, shale gas would not be 37% of our gas supply today if that was not the case. Now, there is an issue, and Ryan spoke about it, touched upon it, which is state versus federal regulation and where the repository should be. And I think he made a strong point about timeliness of regulation and being close to the community. And I think that the stronger that he mentioned, the Association of State Regulators, is a very effective way to go, and I think this will continue to be a subject of discussion. Where does regulation need to be? But we ought to look at what's working today.
Well, I'm going to come back on a couple of
I don't know
points.
if you actually have the same conclusions from the study, but...
We always think exactly the same. Andrew.
Well, I think Mayor Bloomberg got it right when particularly talking about methane. Look, shale gas is a great blessing, and it can be a very valuable transition to a clean economy. We should not assume that gas is less bad for climate change than coal. Depends how much methane leaks out, and we actually don't know yet. Some good companies, ConocoPhillips, I'm sure does know, but there are hundreds of contractors drilling at the moment. There are no measures of exactly how much is leaking. And numbers, again, the scientists don't agree fully, but if you talk to the Environmental Defense Fund, doing a huge amount of work on that, and others, something slightly over 3% is the number. If the leakage of methane is more than that, turns out, if you look at a 30-year horizon, that actually gas is more polluting in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the good news is it's extremely easy to bring those leakages down to 1% or below, in which case then it actually is much healthier. The problem is that certainly most countries, and even here in the United States, we don't have accurate measures of leakage. So that needs to be a very important thing. We've just brought out a report 3 weeks ago that looks at leakage throughout the entire chain and basically looking at various solutions. But they don't exist now. Just because it's easy to do doesn't actually mean they're being done. Again, the second piece of good news is it's actually smart for companies to stop leakage because that gas is actually quite valuable as well. It's one of those remarkable things about, economists believe that there aren't $100 bills lying on the sidewalk because someone will have picked them up already. Actually, there are thousands and thousands of $100 bills that people are not picking up.
I really commend your attention to this new World Resources Institute report called Clearing the Air. It's terrific in surveying the issues as we know them today. Jason, do you have comments on this one? Since indeed you were, in some sense, the father of this Secretary of Energy Advisory Board.
Well, we'll move on to other topics. I would just quickly say that I think, there are real risks. We know how to manage them for the most part around wastewater, around measuring methane and limiting it, as you said. We know how to do that in a low-cost way, proper cementing and casing of the well, disclosure of the chemicals. So we just need to make sure that's done through a combination of state and federal regulation. One positive development I thought about a month or so ago was a group of NGOs, including EDF, industry, and universities got together and released a set of certification standards through the Center for Sustainable Shale Development to say, let's all come together and agree on what best practices are, and if someone is going to be using unconventional production methods in your neighborhood, you should demand that they meet that certification standard, similar to the way we have LEED certification standards, a voluntary program people have created to show buildings that are energy efficient. And you mentioned the IEA's, Golden Rules for Golden Age of Gas study, and one really important thing from that study was they actually estimated the incremental cost per well to do it the right way, and it's cheap. So we know what it takes to do it the right way. We can do it and still produce our domestic resources. We just have to make sure everyone's doing it that way.
One of the reasons I started with this question is that in many communities around the United States, and certainly in other countries too, this question of how we develop this resource is the subject at times of a third rail split amongst the sides of the debate. It comes up in the export questions. How can we be developing this resource if we're not developing it right, and then doing it for other people, for heaven's sakes? It comes up in terms of fights between renewable advocates and natural gas advocates who may actually both have the same point of view with respect to improvements relative to coal, but this question of how you develop it sustainably then becomes a rail between them. And so I wonder if you can talk about some of these questions about the extent to which we can think about this opportunity for trade, for relationships with other countries that really shift some of the geopolitical issues, and in terms of having synergies with renewable development rather than antagonistic relations as the mayor described earlier. Any thoughts? Dan, you want to talk about LNG exports?
Well, I think I can probably talk about it more easily than Carlos can. Since I don't think he can talk about them. You know, it's interesting, and this goes to what Jason said this morning, and one of the reasons the center exists, that just how quickly we've turned around to having this discussion, and some people have really taken the lead here to do that. And it seems to me that it's gotten awfully fevered beyond what is the reality. And the reality is that we probably will end up with about 3 to 5 projects being built, seems to be the number. And I think that some of the debate that's going on in this country that all the gas is going to be drained out of the country is missing 2 things. One, their competitors. Canada intends to, at least they say, have 5 export facilities in British Columbia. It's possible that Alaska will be an exporter. And of course, it may be high cost, but Australia is going to put a lot more gas into the market. And then there's these phenomenal resources off East Africa. So there's a lot of competition. I think the other thing is, and some people in this room know it very well, we don't have an endless, peak engineers and peak geologists. Certainly peak engineers, we don't have enough skilled people to do a lot of projects at once, and if we do, will happen the same thing that happened in Australia. The cost will go up, and that will affect the competitive landscape. So I actually think there are natural market forces that will put limits on natural gas exports.
Other thoughts on this larger theme? Andrew? And then Ambassador? Andrew, go ahead.
Let me twist it just a little bit. Certainly, if the United States continues to be a leader in making sure that the gas is taken out of the ground and processed in an environmentally and socially responsible way, that can play a very valuable role worldwide, precisely in this kind of economic revolution that I was talking about. I think much bigger issues apply actually to coal, quite frankly. Last year, the United States, I think, closed down 55 coal-powered plants. I think we still have 390 odd.
The owners of the coal plants shut them down, not the United States.
Yeah, and the reason they shut them down, the reason the owners shut them down was it was a smart thing to do. Largely, it was due to much cheaper gas, and also it was due to a rationality that, wait a minute, you know, this climate change thing's real, and this is not going to be a long-term going concern. But of course, what's happened is, I mean, I was in Europe last week, and you know, Europe's actually enjoying American coal, and actually, I mean, a lot of people there believe it is undermining renewables. Now, it's not the job of the United States to sort of get on its moral high hobby horse and say, you know, we're not going to sell you coal because we don't trust you. But it's an interesting issue for international politics right now. We just did a review of all of the planned coal-powered electricity generating plants in the world. There are 1,200 of them currently being developed. So 55 closed down here, 1,200 of them being developed, of which 75% are in India and China. Now, if those all go ahead with cheap coal that is cheap, because this is not good for the future of the world, because we actually have to peak our greenhouse gases by 2020, and we are absolutely not on track to do that.
Thank you. Ambassador.
Just a couple of things. I think one, to pick up on a point Dan made, there's been a lot of focus on the development of shale gas in the United States and the implications of that. One of the things Dan said is that this is not just shale gas in the United States. There are massive changes that are happening in global gas markets throughout the world. Australia has some of the, as Dan said, some of the largest supplies that are coming on the market soon. But Norway has had some of the largest gas finds it's had since 1942. Mozambique, Tanzania, as he mentioned. Russia has set a target of 1 trillion cubic meters of gas production by the year of 2030. Recognize that right now they are exporting only 15 BCM to the Asian market right now out of Sakhalin. That's going to radically change. The nature of that Asian market is going to phenomenally change from a range of different supplies coming into the market, including even from the Mediterranean. And so what we're beginning to see are two fundamental changes in this market. One is the increase in supply, but increasingly what we're also seeing is that a greater and greater share of gas on global market is traded as LNG, which literally and figuratively make that gas and make that market more liquid, right? And as a result of that, it's going to result in different trading patterns, different pricing patterns. I don't know what that market's going to look like in 10 years, but I would guess that if you have a lot more gas traded in a way that doesn't have the kinds of physical boundaries that you have today, that it's probably going to be a very different market than what we have. The second thing that I think is really important is that we've already seen some of the geopolitical impacts, and the biggest impacts thus far, I think, have been in Europe. The United States at this point was expected to be importing about 80 BCM of gas a year. We're importing about 5, almost all of that from Canada. As a result of that, a lot of the gas that was supposed to be coming here has been rediverted to Europe. It's created competition in that market, and gas has gone from about 20 BCM a year to about 70 BCM a year in the European market. It has become the biggest competitor with Russian gas. It's resulted in most of the Western European utilities renegotiating their contracts with Gazprom to lower prices and extend the financing terms. That's had a massive impact when you put it together with the changes that Europe has made in the third energy package so that you can't own the gas, own the pipelines, and own the distribution systems. There's been an emergence of a competitive market there that now allows for things like gas to be imported from Norway to the German coast that the Czechs might be purchasing, that they will swap with Russian gas that's coming in through Poland and Germany, and that Russian gas may end up in the Czech Republic and the Norwegian gas may end up in Germany, but we're really beginning to see swaps and arrangements that we may never have anticipated. That is a great plus for energy security. And if we keep asking ourselves the question, how do we build on those lessons to then look at the fastest growing gas market in the world in Asia, then that does have some real geopolitical significance.
Thank you. Jason.
Just quickly, I agree with everything Carlos just said. I'll just add the one thing he's not allowed to say, which is LNG exports is part of that story. So I'm generally not a fan of, that's the question you started with.
Put your mic down a little bit lower.
You started with the question about LNG exports, and so again, I'm generally not a fan of restraints on trade, so I think one question is, we think increasing exports is a good thing, and is there something different about energy that would make us think differently about that? There are some things that are different about energy, but I don't think they fundamentally change that calculus. I think too much of the debate domestically on LNG exports has been about whether it's good or bad for Andy Liveris and Dow Chemical, and I think there are economic impacts that are important, including the increase in production that we might see and the economic activity that generates, but there is an important geopolitical story, too, to the U.S. engaging in the global energy market for the potential it has to encourage a delinking of gas prices from oil, which could drive down the price of natural gas, encourage coal to gas substitution, oil to gas substitution, general support for free trade as we, push China to lift restrictions on rare earth element exports and other things. We want to show the world that it makes it more difficult for us to do that if we don't live by those same rules, and to help our allies like Japan and India and countries that really are struggling to meet their energy needs, and we can help play a role to provide them with affordable energy. I think we should do that.
Thank you. Andrew, you talked about coal, and several of today's speakers, including National Security Advisor Donnellan, mentioned the security risks associated with making sure that we have secure energy and affordable energy and clean energy. And you think of the billions of middle-class aspirants around the world, and you think about the coal in those countries, it just is hard to imagine how we will turn the corner on emissions of greenhouse gases in that scenario. Many people talk today about the doubling, quintupling, 10 times X renewable development in a number of countries, but it's on a very small base compared to coal. So you really see that dramatic change trajectory-wise, but it's still a small imprint. So what are the best ideas that you think are out there? New ideas, either that the United States can do or that we can engage in with private partners or other things to actually address this profound tension between the energy aspirations of so many people and the climate implications given cheap coal? Oh, that's a small question. Where do you want, Andrew?
Well, I think we can all, including the United States government, be proud of what we're doing to research carbon capture and storage, but the plain fact of the matter is it's very small, and it would be smarter actually to take some of that money that's subsidizing people who are consuming too much fossil-based fuel and actually put that in carbon capture and storage research. You think what's happened to the price of photovoltaic chips in the last, 80% decline in the last 4 years. We aren't seeing that kind of progress in carbon capture and storage. When I worked for the British government, I was on the sort of ministerial level committee charged with looking at Britain's energy, and that was 5 years ago, and we were planning our first carbon capture and storage. And then we realized we needed $1 billion extra, and actually turned out that we didn't have it, so only now they're going ahead. So there's really not a seriousness about the carbon capture and storage the way there needs to be, but we do definitely need it. So I wouldn't for one moment say that we should only do renewables, because as you say, the existing stock, it's very important to understand the arithmetic, by the way, because some people say, oh, renewables will never catch up. They're always going to be trivial. Well, it turns out that in terms of new generation last year, something like 250 billion of new electricity generating investments in renewables worldwide, about 320 billion fossil fuel. So pretty close. I mean, the gap used to be 8 to 1. Now it's about 85% of what. So in other words, that number's important. So don't believe those who say, oh, it'll never catch up. It will, because actually fossil-based fuels power plants will die in the next 40 years. So as long as starting today, we started to invest in no coal. Now, I think coming from the World Bank, obviously this is a huge issue of should the World Bank provide financing for coal. And in the climate investment funds that I oversaw, which was a $7 billion program, we were willing to finance readiness for carbon capture and storage, but only if it were ultra critical. And I mean, it would be great if the leading financial institutions in the world would really adopt standards that are tougher than they are now.
I think we just have to keep in mind, of course, carbon capture and storage, the scale that would be involved. We have this industry, some people call it big oil. We'd have to have this whole other industry called big carbon that would be doing everything in reverse.
Other comments?
I don't know if I'm breaking the rules by asking a question, but
go for it. This is your party.
Dr. Steere mentioned fossil fuel subsidies, and I was just wondering if you could say a word about the path to get to where we need to in terms of what governments can do, what multilateral organizations can do, particularly given that the bulk of fossil fuel subsidies are not from developing countries, but from major producers like Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Well, I do believe that momentum is building politically around the world on this issue. It won't be hard law, but it's interesting how the politics of change of economic policy occurs. When I started my career, most countries had distorted trade markets. Most countries had badly run fiscal and macroeconomic policies. In the space of 20 years, that changed radically. Why? because actually finance ministers talk to each other. They tend to have PhDs now from, good American universities or European universities. They actually talk.
Columbia.
The best ones are here. And so actually there is a talking up of the issue right now. Jim Kim, the president of the World Bank, has said, I'm going to aim at 4 things to address climate change. Number 1, energy subsidies. So, for example, the G20 last year came up with a pretty good statement. Rio Plus 20 came up with a dreadful statement because you can't get 194 countries to agree. But actually the G20 was not bad. Here's the thing. If you talk to Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who's the finance minister of Nigeria, she will say, this is very difficult. We tried it last year, riots in the street, we raised energy prices, dreadful, we had to rescind them, too difficult. Well, at least it was for them, right there. But if you go to Indonesia, President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono there, he had to double the price of energy in order to eliminate energy subsidies. He said to his cabinet, I'm willing to do it if you can come up with a compensation for the bottom 30% of the population that will be cash compensation so that they don't get any poorer in real terms. In 4 months, they put that together. I was very heavily involved in that. It worked beautifully, doubled energy prices. There was virtually no political opposition, except for those in the middle class who actually wanted some of those cash compensations. He used about 25% of the revenues that he gained to give to the poor, and the poor used that money far, far, far better than they ever would have. Iran, amazingly, has been a leader in this idea of they used 70% of the revenue they got through increasing energy prices in order to. So, I mean, I think it's extremely difficult, but I think we are learning quite a bit right now.
Ambassador.
Just picking up on what Andrew said, let's go back to the example of Nigeria. So two contrasting situations there. In December of 2011, January 2012, they looked to lift diesel subsidies. They do it very quickly. There's very little public preparation for it, and exactly as you said, they had very significant protests. About 4 months later, they began a program to raise electricity prices. It was part of a massive reform of their electricity sector, including privatization of most of their generation and distribution capabilities. They started public service announcements, engaging with community organizations, explaining why they were increasing prices, created a tiered price structure to do exactly as you were saying, to provide for subsidies for the poor and phase out subsidies for others. Price changes were made in June. There was not a single protest. So same country, different approach, quite a significant success. On the coal issue, I guess 2 countries that are, I think, particularly significant and fascinating are China and India. China, let's start there. Let's think about coal not as just an environmental issue or an economic issue, but as a political issue. If there is a serious issue of public protest in China, it's been over pollution. And so the interest that the government has taken is to find ways to reduce its dependency on coal and to diversify. And this is one of the areas where gas may not be the panacea, but gas can certainly be an option, moving along, Andrew, exactly as you said, pushing the renewables curve as far as you can. But if there are opportunities in the near term to make major gains from coal to gas and have some of the same patterns that we have had in the United States for reduced CO2 emissions, that's more than significant. I mean, it's massive in terms of its impact given the scale. India, a similar story, slightly smaller in terms of impact. But if there are 2 countries around the world where I've been traveling and in the conversations that we've had, they have had just a focused and an incredible focus on how to bring cleaner fuels and in particular how to be able to maximize the use of gas in an environmentally sound way within those economies. It's really been China and India. And I think that this is an area where our economic policies, our environmental policies, our national security policies, our strategic interests actually coincide. And part of the challenge is to figure out how do we make this a consistent, sustained part of foreign policy. As Tom Donilon said, not that typical for a national security advisor to address a conference like this, but it's indicative of the changing sets of strategic interests I think that we have globally.
Thank you. One of the themes we heard from the mayor was the important role of cities. And as we are here to celebrate your launch, Jason, and we know the global nature of your mission, I'm interested to hear your thoughts about what are the role of cities in these changing energy dynamics. I don't know, Ambassador, whether city issues, subnational issues rise up very often, but certainly for your work, Andrew, it comes up a lot. And Jason, it'd be interesting to know how much you'll be looking at the drivers in other sectors besides national governments and other things that you're looking at.
Well, cities are absolutely central to whether we succeed or fail. Cities can be a huge part of the solution, as I was mentioning before about New York City, or they could make things worse if we, and when you think of the fact that 900 million people every decade for the next 3 decades will be added to city populations, there are some real choices out there that will last for 300 or 400 years. And so if we, for example, work in Ahmedabad will probably more than double its population in the next 30 years. And we basically work with the local government to say, look, there are some choices here. Here's what you can do. Or you can go the route of actually more mixed use, more condensed, closer together, public, transport driven, and it makes all the difference in the world. Now, the point is, if you say to the mayor or you say to the Minister of Finance or the Minister of Planning, oh, and by the way, you'd be helping to solve global climate change, they'd say, well, thanks very much. That's not in my terms of reference. But if you say, well, actually, it turns out that Barcelona and Singapore and Curitiba, there's a lot of evidence that actually shows that these cities are much more efficient, including New York, much more efficient for lots of well-known reasons. We haven't done a good job explaining that. So you've got sort of a choice, if you like, Mr. Mayor or Madam Mayor. You can grow, inefficiently. Now, here's the problem. The problem is in some countries, the bias is in the other way, especially China. Mm-hmm. How does China finance the expansion of the city? Well, they own the land in the suburbs. So the best way they raise money is by selling land further and further and further out. And so that is how the cities grow. Until that policy is changed, we simply won't get to where we need to get to. But there's some incredibly exciting things. And one of the delights for me in my new job has been to work with private sector players, some of whom, invest in building materials, in, let's say, Otis elevators. Turns out that Otis elevators, it's in their interest that China develops its cities the right way. Why? Because actually they'll need more elevators. So I was wondering why they were so interested in our China urban work. Well, and that's good. What we ought to be doing is identifying interlocking circles whereby we use the power of the market to actually encourage the right thing.
Jason, will we be looking at cities, you
Yeah,
think?
no, absolutely. I mean, it's not an accident that the keynotes today were the mayor and the national security advisor. Partly that's the biggest names I could get, but it's more than that. It is because energy and environment is very fundamentally a local issue, and clearly, as we heard, a global and national security issue. And it's important, if you're going to understand it, to look across the board. And so we're going to be doing that. We're working with them now on some of the direct experience I had during Hurricane Sandy and how to help the city. You heard the mayor say in about a month they'll have their plan, their report, and then we'll be working with the city to sort of convene stakeholders to discuss implementation of the recommendations in that report, and we'll be working with them, on a host of other issues as well. It probably is true that given my experience, my bias a little bit is to think about the federal policy level, and so I actually hope that all of you here today who are going to be involved with the center, particularly if you're part of the Columbia community, will help us really think about the critical local issues and the kinds of questions we should be asking, because it's important for us to do.
We are closing in here at the end of this panel, and I really am interested to hear what advice you would give to Jason with regard to important analytic questions, important convening roles that could be afforded by this new center, important networking, other kinds of investments that could be made. So any advice that you would share with him from your vantage point?
Let me jump in and start, because I'll pick up on the last theme of cities as
Good.
well. Three things. First, waste-to-energy projects. I mean, look, we're in an urbanizing world. There's a phenomenal amount of trash out there. We've got to do something with it. This is technology that exists. We're using it in the United States. We're using it around the world. The Asian Development Bank has just funded 3 projects in China. Think about Manila or Jakarta or any major urban center in Asia, and how much more we could do. This billions of dollars worth of profitable investments. It goes back on your theme of picking up the $100 bills are in the street. These $100 bills are in the form of trash, and we're not picking them up and actually utilizing them. I just want to reinforce building efficiency. So, you know, if we think about the year 2030, 70% of the buildings in India and China that are going to exist have not been built. And so if we think about building codes and they're being focused on an urban basis, if we have the ability to change the infrastructure that's going to exist in 20 years, we can radically, massively change the draw on our energy resources. And similarly, the whole issue of smart grids and the way that we integrate information technology, and again, something which has to happen on an urban basis. And so I think those are huge issues that you can make a tremendous contribution to, and facilitating the city-to-city linkages of exchanging some of that information, I think, is absolutely key. The other thing that I don't think we've touched enough on, and we have a huge need for greater work on, and this is obviously the right place to do it, is finance. Because the amount, look, if we think about, I mentioned earlier that there's going to be $17 trillion of investment in power sector investments over the next 20 years. This has to come from the private sector. It's going to depend on private finance. It's a lot easier to do it in developed countries. It's harder to do it in emerging countries. It's even harder to do it in developing countries. And then if you think about how you develop the right financial models that are commercially viable in small scale off-grid development, boy, that gets really hard. And if we want to address a combination of the transformation of our economies, but as Andrew was saying earlier, if we think it's important to bring the 1.3 billion people in the world that don't have access to electricity into a modern energy economy, then we got to figure out how do we create the right kinds of financial and commercial models to do this in a viable way. And there's no better place in the world to do this than in this city.
Thank you. Dan.
Well, I think at a high level, you might say, try to look down the road and around the corner. That would be a very helpful thing to do. But I think more specifically, I go back to the point that Jason mentioned when he was in the White House, and these questions would come up, and you look around, well, where's the policy discussion of these market issues? And so I'm very mindful of what Carlos said, that $6 trillion of investment next 25 years will go into renewable energy. Compare that to $1 trillion over the last 12 years. It's a big number, but at least at this point, it still looks like 75–80% of the energy mix is going to be hydrocarbons in some form or another. And so I would say one contribution that this center could make that maybe where there is a gap is staying rooted in the energy markets and the policy issues, the energy markets as they are, the financial but also the physical markets, how they are, and the policy issues that come out of that. And you gave a whole agenda right there at the beginning, and 3 years from now there'll be another agenda of those issues. So I think that's a real distinctive contribution the center can make.
Thank you, Dan. Andrew?
Well, I'm sure you've already got a very good work program, and it seems that way already listening to you. I do think, though, a school like this has a choice. You could, according to how big you are and what your capacity is, you either stick very much with the global markets, the global supply and demand for energy, or you also, and obviously you want to stick to the international side, given where you are. Do you also, though, look, for example, at the global politics of things like energy subsidies, the global politics of the way cities are run and so on, the global politics of how energy enters the UNFCCC negotiations and so on? I mean, I would encourage you to do that, and I would absolutely encourage you to convene the emerging and developing world. I think this is New York City, your Columbia University, You know, if you build it, they will come. They will have great discussions here. And you think about, you are so grounded in the US situation, which they really want to know. But then over there you've got David Sandelow, who knows who's who out there in the global place as well. I mean, you are very well equipped, actually, to become a sort of go-to place. We'd be delighted to work with you on that.
And it would satisfy the mayor's objective of bringing more money to New York City. Before passing it to you, Jason, I want to just add a couple of other things to the agenda. I totally agree with the important role that you can play in bringing these connections between public policy and finance. Public policy and business models that work in a variety of arenas. There will be real tensions in yesterday's business models for these new futures. So I think there's a lot to match the investment requirements that will really require unleashing private investment, and yet we have these tensions of business models. The other thing is that the theme of water, infrastructure resiliency, and energy nexus is just everywhere as an important challenge. In Africa, it's in Asia, it's in the United States. And at the home of Hurricane Sandy, what better place to deal with those intersections of telecommunications, energy infrastructure, and so many other parts of the economy. So, Jason, I'm passing it to you.
I just want to say thanks to all of you, for this distinguished group of people, for joining on the closing panel today and for making time to be with us to celebrate here in New York, and for your advice. And I will continue to call on you for help and guidance to be sure. I thought this morning was great. If you're still here and you thought this was interesting and you thought this was fun, then this center is for you. Yes. Because I had a great morning. I learned an enormous amount. This is incredibly fun. I could not be more excited and enthusiastic about what Columbia is starting here. We're going to be moving fast. We've already moved fast. I'm going to go get something to eat, and then we have a meeting at 3 p.m. to talk about how to do this all over again on June 6th in London, because we are a global center and we want to let the rest of the world know that we're here as well. In May 14th, we'll be having a day-long workshop here to discuss the Pacific Rim impacts of the North American shale revolution, with dozens of people who are coming over from Korea and China and Japan. So if this is exciting for you, and I hope it is, please be a part of it. Please help us. Sign up for our mailing list at energypolicy.columbia.edu. Follow us on Twitter at ColumbiaUEnergy. And please join me in thanking again the extraordinary lineup of speakers that we had today.